My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 68 years old, and I never imagined my own daughter would steal from me while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. 3 weeks ago, I returned home from heart surgery to find my garage empty. When I asked my daughter Susan where my late husband's 1967 Corvette Stingray was, she actually had the nerve to smile and say, "I sold that old thing while you were away. Mom, you don't even drive anymore, and it was just taking up space." I stood there in shock as she continued, "I got $15,000 for it. I thought you'd be grateful I was helping you declutter." Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever dealt with family members who thought they could take advantage of you just because of your age. Trust me, you'll want to see how this played out. My daughter had no idea that the old car she sold for $15,000 was actually worth $200,000. She also had no idea that I had every legal document, every maintenance record, and every photograph of that car safely stored away. But most importantly, she had no idea that at 68 years old, I wasn't about to let anyone, not even my own child, steal the last precious connection I had to my beloved husband Robert. That car wasn't just transportation, it was 30 years of love, dreams, and memory. It was the symbol of everything Robert and I had worked for together. And when I discovered what Susan had done, something inside me that had been dormant since Robert's death suddenly came roaring back to life. To understand why this betrayal cut so deeply, you need to know the story of Robert and me, and how that beautiful red Corvette became the center of our world. I met my husband Robert in 1975 at a classic car show in downtown Hartford. I was 19, fresh out of high school, and had only gone because my friend Linda dragged me along. But there he was, 22 years old, with grease under his fingernails and the biggest smile I'd ever seen, lovingly polishing a 1965 Mustang that belonged to his uncle. "She's a beauty, isn't she?" he said when he caught me staring. I thought he was talking about me until I realized his eyes were fixed on that car. That's when I knew any man who could love a machine that much would love a woman even more. We talked for hours that day about engines and chrome and the magic of American muscle cars. Robert had this dream. He told me someday when he had saved enough money, he was going to buy a 1967 Corvette Stingray, the most beautiful car ever made. He called it Rally Red with a white interior. "That's going to be our Sunday drive car when we're old and gray." Even then, at 19, I knew I wanted to be part of that dream. We married 2 years later, and Robert got a job as a mechanic while I became an elementary school teacher. Every Friday night, we would sit at our kitchen table with a coffee can labeled Corvette Fund and drop in whatever extra money we could spare. Some weeks it was $50, some weeks it was $5, but we never missed a week. For 30 years, Robert and I fed that coffee can. Through my pregnancies with Susan and Michael, through Robert's back injury that kept him out of work for 6 months, through my mother's funeral expenses and the kids' college tuition, the Corvette Fund was sacred. We never touched it, no matter how tight money got. "Someday, Maggie," Robert would say every Friday night as he sealed the can, "someday we're going to find her." And finally, in 2005, we did. Robert was 52, I was 49, and we had saved $45,000. We drove 3 states away to look at a 1967 Corvette Stingray that had been advertised in Classic Car Weekly, Rally Red with white interior, just like Robert had dreamed. The owner was a collector in his 70s who had babied that car for decades. When he saw the wonder in Robert's eyes, the same wonder I'd fallen in love with 30 years earlier, he smiled and said, "This car needs to go to someone who will love her like I have." The drive home was pure magic. Robert's hands gripped the steering wheel like he was holding something precious, which he was. I remember looking over at him as we cruised down the highway, the wind whipping through my hair, and thinking, this is what happiness looks like. For the next 15 years, that Corvette was our joy. Every Sunday after church, we would take her out for drives through the Connecticut countryside. We went to car shows, made friends with other collectors, and spent countless Saturday afternoons in the garage with Robert teaching me about carburetors and timing belts. That car represented everything we had worked for together. Every sacrifice, every shared dream, every Friday night we chose to save instead of spend. When Robert had his heart attack 3 years ago, his last words to me were, "Take care of our girl Maggie. She's got all our best memories in her." I promised him I would, and I meant it. My daughter Susan had always been different from her brother, Michael. Where Michael understood the sentimental value of things, Susan saw everything in terms of dollars and cents. At 42, she was a successful real estate agent who drove a brand new BMW and lived in a house twice the size of mine. But somehow, she always seemed to think I had too much. The comments started about a year after Robert's funeral. Mom, do you really need such a big house now that you're alone? She would ask during our Sunday dinners. And that car just sits in the garage most of the time. It seems like such a waste. I tried to explain that the house held 40 years of memories, and the Corvette was my connection to her father, but Susan would just shake her head with that patronizing smile she'd perfected. You're getting older, Mom. It's time to downsize and simplify. Simplify. That became her favorite word. Every conversation somehow circled back to what I should get rid of, what I should sell, what I should let go of for my own good. When I renewed the car insurance for another year, Susan rolled her eyes. Mom, you drove that car maybe 3 times last year. The insurance alone costs more than most people's car payments. It's not about driving it every day. I tried to explain. It's about knowing it's there. It's about keeping my promise to your father. Dad's gone, Mom, she replied coldly. Hoarding his things isn't going to bring him back. Hoarding, that stung. I wasn't hoarding anything. I was preserving memories, honoring a promise, keeping alive the dreams Robert and I had shared. But to Susan, if something wasn't generating income or being used daily, it was worthless clutter. The situation got worse when Susan's husband Mark lost his job last year. Suddenly, their comments became more pointed, more urgent. During Thanksgiving dinner, Mark actually suggested I could help out the family by selling some of my unnecessary assets. That car of yours could probably pay for Tommy's college tuition, he said, referring to my grandson. Wouldn't that be a better use of the money than having it sit in a garage? I reminded them that Tommy was only 8 years old, and that his college fund was their responsibility, not mine. The look Susan and Mark exchanged across my dining room table should have been my first warning. After that, the pressure intensified. Susan started bringing real estate pamphlets to show me charming senior living communities. Think how much easier your life would be, Mom. No yard work, no maintenance, and you'd have people your own age to socialize with. She conveniently ignored the fact that I loved my garden, enjoyed maintaining my home, and had plenty of friends from church and my former teaching colleague. What she really meant was that if I moved to a tiny apartment, I'd have to get rid of the car. The breaking point came 6 months ago when Susan brought an appraiser to my house without asking. I came home from grocery shopping to find a strange man measuring my Corvette and taking photographs. What is going on here? I demanded. Susan had the audacity to look annoyed that I was upset. I just wanted to get an idea of what it's worth, Mom, for estate planning purposes. Estate planning, as if I was already dead, as if my belongings were already hers to distribute. The appraiser, clearly uncomfortable with the family tension, quickly finished his work and left. Later that evening, he called me directly. Miss Wilson, he said quietly, I don't know what's going on with your family, but I thought you should know that car is worth significantly more than your daughter seemed to expect. We're talking collector car prices, not just classic car prices. You've got something very special that. He wouldn't give me specifics over the phone, but he mailed me a formal appraisal report a week later. When I saw the number $200,000, I nearly fell off my chair. Robert and I had bought something extraordinary without even knowing. I put that report in my safety deposit box and didn't tell Susan about the appraisal. Something in my gut told me that information wouldn't be safe with her. I should have trusted that instinct sooner. The call from my cardiologist came on a Tuesday morning in early March. Dr. Martinez had been monitoring my heart condition for months, and the tests weren't improving. Margaret, we need to schedule your surgery sooner rather than later, he explained. Your valve replacement can't wait much longer. Heart surgery at 68 is terrifying, no matter how routine the doctors say it is. As I sat in Dr. Martinez's office, all I could think about was Robert, and how his heart attack had come without warning. What if something happened to me? What if I didn't make it through the surgery? That evening, I called Susan and Michael to let them know about the procedure. Michael, who lives in Oregon with his family, immediately offered to fly out. Mom, you shouldn't go through this alone, he said. But Susan, ever practical, had a different approach. Michael doesn't need to disrupt his work schedule, she told me. I live 20 minutes away. I'll handle everything while you're in the hospital. I was grateful for her offer. Despite our disagreements about the house and the car, she was still my daughter, and I needed family support during this scary time. When Susan offered to stay at my house while I was recovering to keep an eye on things, it seemed like the loving gesture of a concerned daughter. You focus on getting better, Mom, she said, giving me a hug that felt genuine. I'll take care of everything at home. Water your plants, bring in the mail, make sure the house is secure. You don't need to worry about anything except healing. The night before my surgery, I packed a small bag and went through my usual routine of checking doors and windows. I stopped in the garage to say goodbye to the Corvette, running my hand along her red hood like I had seen Robert do 1,000 times. Take care of yourself, beautiful, I whispered. I'll I'll be back soon. I never imagined those would be the last words I'd speak to that car in my own garage. The surgery went well, thank God. Martinez replaced my aortic valve with a procedure that should give me many more years of good health, but the recovery was harder than I expected. What was supposed to be a 5-day hospital stay stretched to 8 days when I developed a minor infection at the incisions. Susan visited every day, bringing flowers and magazines, updating me on neighborhood news. She seemed genuinely caring, asking about my pain levels and when I might be able to come home. Looking back, I wonder if she was really checking on my recovery timeline for her own purpose. Don't rush yourself, Mom, she would say. Take all the time you need to get stronger. The house is fine. Everything is exactly as you left it. That should have been my second warning. Susan was never that patient about anything. Michael called every evening from Oregon, frustrated that he couldn't be there but relieved to hear I was progressing well. During one call, he mentioned something that didn't register as important at the time. Susan told me she's been doing some cleaning and organizing at your house, he said. She said you'd accumulated a lot of things over the years that needed sorting through. Cleaning and organizing. I remember feeling a flicker of unease, but I pushed it aside. I was on pain medication and trying to focus on healing. Maybe Susan was just tidying up, being helpful. On day 6 of my hospital stay, Susan seemed different during her visit. More excited, almost giddy. She kept checking her phone and seemed distracted when I was talking to her. Is everything all right, dear? Oh yes, everything's wonderful, she replied with a brightness that seemed forced. I've just been very productive while you've been resting, getting a lot accomplished. Again, that strange choice of words. Productive, accomplished. But I was tired, and the pain medication made it hard to think clearly. I assumed she meant housework, or maybe organizing my paperwork like she'd been suggesting for months. On my final day in the hospital, as Dr. Martinez was reviewing my discharge instructions, Susan arrived with a bouquet of roses and an unusually cheerful demeanor. Ready to come home, Mom? She asked, practically bouncing on her feet. I think you're going to be very pleased with how I've taken care of things. The discharge process took longer than expected. Insurance paperwork, medication instructions, follow-up appointments to schedule. By the time we finally left the hospital, it was late afternoon, and I was exhausted. During the 20-minute drive home, Susan chattered constantly about my neighbors, her work, Tommy's upcoming baseball season, anything except what had been happening at my house during my absence. When I tried to ask about the mail or whether my plants had survived, she quickly changed the subject. You'll see everything soon enough, she said with what I now recognize was barely contained anticipation. Let's just focus on getting you settled in safely. As we turned onto my street, I felt that familiar surge of comfort at seeing my neighborhood again. Mrs. Patterson waved from her front yard, and everything looked exactly as I'd left it. My house sat peacefully on its corner lot, the gardens dormant but tidy in the early spring light. It wasn't until Susan pulled into my driveway that I noticed the garage door was closed. I always left it slightly open for ventilation, especially in winter. Robert had taught me that cars need to breathe, even when they're not running. Why is the garage closed? I asked as Susan helped me out of her car. She didn't answer immediately, busying herself with gathering my hospital bag and the flowers. Let's get you inside first, Mom. You need to rest. But something in her tone, something in the way she avoided looking toward the garage, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the March weather. The call from my cardiologist came on a Tuesday morning in early March. Dr. Martinez had been monitoring my heart condition for months, and the tests weren't improving. Margaret, we need to schedule your surgery sooner rather than later, he explained. Your valve replacement can't wait much longer. Heart surgery at 68 is terrifying, no matter how routine the doctors say it is. As I sat in Dr. Martinez's office, all I could think about was Robert and how his heart attack had come without warning. What if something happened to me? What if I didn't make it through the surgery? That evening, I called Susan and Michael to let them know about the procedure. Michael, who lives in Oregon with his family, immediately offered to fly out. Mom, you shouldn't go through this alone, he said. But Susan, ever practical, had a different approach. Michael doesn't need to disrupt his work schedule, she told me. I live 20 minutes away. I'll handle everything while you're in the hospital. I was grateful for her offer. Despite our disagreements about the house and the car, she was still my daughter, and I needed family support during this scary time. When Susan offered to stay at my house while I was recovering to keep an eye on things, it seemed like the loving gesture of a concerned daughter. You focus on getting better, Mom, she said, giving me a hug that felt genuine. I'll take care of everything everything at home. Water your plants, bring in the mail, make sure the house is secure. You don't need to worry about anything except healing. The night before my surgery, I packed a small bag and went through my usual routine of checking doors and windows. I stopped in the garage to say goodbye to the Corvette, running my hand along her red hood like I had seen Robert do 1,000 times. "Take care of yourself, beautiful," I whispered. "I'll be back soon." I never imagined those would be the last words I'd speak to that car in my own garage. The surgery went well, thank God. Martinez replaced my aortic valve with a procedure that should give me many more years of good health, but the recovery was harder than I expected. What was supposed to be a 5-day hospital stay stretched to 8 days when I developed a minor infection at the incision site. Susan visited every day, bringing flowers and magazines, updating me on neighborhood news. She seemed genuinely caring, asking about my pain levels and when I might be able to come home. Looking back, I wonder if she was really checking on my recovery timeline for her own purposes. "Don't rush yourself, Mom," she would say. "Take all the time you need to get stronger. The house is fine. Everything is exactly as you left it." That should have been my second warning. Susan was never that patient about anything. Michael called every evening from Oregon, frustrated that he couldn't be there but relieved to hear I was progressing well. During one call, he mentioned something that didn't register as important at the time. "Susan told me she's been doing some cleaning and organizing at your house," he said. "She said you'd accumulated a lot of things over the years that needed sorting through." Cleaning and organizing. I remember feeling a flicker of unease, but I pushed it aside. I was on pain medication and trying to focus on healing. Maybe Susan was just tidying up, being helpful. On day 6 of my hospital stay, Susan seemed different during her visit. More excited, almost giddy. She kept checking her phone and seemed distracted when I was talking to her. "Is everything all right, dear?" I asked. "Oh yes, everything's wonderful," she replied with a brightness that seemed forced. "I've just been very productive while you've been resting, getting a lot accomplished." Again, that strange choice of words, productive, accomplished. But I was tired, and the pain medication made it hard to think clearly. I assumed she meant housework or maybe organizing my paperwork like she'd been suggesting for months. On my final day in the hospital, as Dr. Martinez was reviewing my discharge instructions, Susan arrived with a bouquet of roses and an unusually cheerful demeanor. "Ready to come home, Mom?" she asked, practically bouncing on her feet. "I think you're going to be very pleased with how I've taken care of things." The discharge process took longer than expected. Insurance paperwork, medication instructions, follow-up appointments to schedule. By the time we finally left the hospital, it was late afternoon, and I was exhausted. During the 20-minute drive home, Susan chattered constantly about my neighbors, her work, Tommy's upcoming baseball season, anything except what had been happening at my house during my absence. When I tried to ask about the mail or whether my plants had survived, she quickly changed the subject. "You'll see everything soon enough," she said with what I now recognize was barely contained anticipation. "Let's just focus on getting you settled in safe." As we turned onto my street, I felt that familiar surge of comfort at seeing my neighborhood again. Mrs. Patterson waved from her front yard, and everything looked exactly as I'd left it. My house sat peacefully on its corner lot, the gardens dormant but tidy in the early spring light. It wasn't until Susan pulled into my driveway that I noticed the garage door was closed. I always left it slightly open for ventilation, especially in winter. Robert had taught me that cars need to breathe, even when they're not running. "Why is the garage closed?" I asked as Susan helped me out of her car. She didn't answer immediately, busying herself with gathering my hospital bag and the flowers. "Let's get you inside first, Mom. You need to rest." But something in her tone, something in the way she avoided looking toward the garage, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the March weather. The moment I walked through my front door, I knew something was wrong. The house felt different, emptier somehow, though I couldn't immediately put my finger on why. Everything looked normal at first glance. My furniture was in place, my photographs were on the mantel, my grandmother's china still sat safely in the cabinet, but there was an absence in the air, a hollowness that made my chest tighten with anxiety that had nothing to do with my recent surgery. "Let me help you to your chair, Mom," Susan said, guiding me toward the living room with unusual attentiveness. "You must be exhausted from the hospital. Why don't you rest while I make you some tea?" I settled into Robert's old recliner, the one place in the house that still smelled faintly like his aftershave after 3 years. As Susan bustled around in the kitchen, I looked around more carefully. Something was definitely off, but I couldn't identify what. Then it hit me, the silence. The house was too quiet. For 3 years since Robert's death, I had developed a routine every time I came home. I would walk through the house, check that everything was secure, and then I would go to the garage, not to drive anywhere necessarily, but just to see the Corvette, to run my hand along her hood, to sit in the driver's seat for a few minutes and remember Sunday drives with Robert. It was my way of saying I'm home, to both my house and my husband's memory. But today, something was keeping me from following that routine. Maybe it was exhaustion from the surgery, or maybe it was the way Susan kept hovering, but I found myself putting off that trip to the garage. Susan returned with tea and a plate of cookies, settling herself on the couch across from me, with that same strange energy she'd had at the hospital. So, she said, barely able to contain herself, do you want to hear about everything I accomplished while you were away? The word accomplished again. It grated against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. What kind of things? I asked carefully. Well, she began, her eyes bright with excitement. I did a lot of organizing. You know how you've been putting off dealing with some of the clutter around here. I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to help you simplify. My heart began to beat faster, and not from my recent cardiac procedure. What exactly did you organize, Susan? Oh, just things that were taking up unnecessary space, she said with a wave of her hand. Things you never use anymore. I was very thoughtful about it, Mom. I only dealt with items that were clearly just sitting around collecting dust. The way she emphasized clearly made my stomach drop. Susan had never been good at reading the true value of anything that wasn't immediately obvious. To her, if something looked old or wasn't being used daily, it was automatically worthless. Susan, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, I need you to be specific. What exactly did you organize? For the first time since I'd been home, her confident demeanor flickered slightly. Well, you know how you always said you barely drive anymore, and with your health scare, I thought it would be good to eliminate some of the responsibilities and expenses you don't really need. My blood went cold. The car, I whispered. Now, Mom, before you get upset, just listen, she said quickly, holding up her hands. I found a very nice collector who was willing to take it off your hands. He appreciated it much more than it was being appreciated here. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt weak. Susan, where is my car? I sold it, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I sold that old Corvette while you were in the hospital. The man paid cash, $15,000, which is sitting safely in your savings account right now. The room spun around me. I gripped the arms of Robert's chair so tightly my knuckles went white. You sold Robert's car. It's not Robert's car anymore, Mom, Susan said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. Robert's been gone for 3 years. It was just sitting in the garage, costing you money and insurance, and taking up space you could use for something practical. You had no right, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ear. I had every right, she shot back, her facade of concern finally dropping. You gave me keys to the house. You asked me to take care of things. That's exactly what I did. I took care of a problem you've been avoiding. A problem? The word came out as a gasp. That car was not a problem. That car was. I couldn't finish the sentence. How could I explain to someone who had never truly loved anything that the car wasn't just metal and chrome? How could I make her understand that she had just sold 30 years of Friday night dreams, 15 years of Sunday afternoon joy, and the last tangible piece of my marriage? Mom, you don't even drive anymore, Susan continued, apparently interpreting my silence as acceptance. You went to the grocery store maybe once a week, and you could barely see over the steering wheel of that thing. The new owner is actually going to drive it, appreciate it, take it to car shows. Isn't that better? You don't understand, I whispered, tears starting to blur my vision. That wasn't just a car. It was exactly just a car, she said firmly. An old car that was draining your resources and serving no practical purpose. I thought you'd be grateful that I handled such a difficult decision for you. Grateful. She actually expected me to be grateful that she had stolen and sold the most precious thing I owned. I want it back, I said quietly. Susan laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Mom, it's sold, gone. The man who bought it was thrilled to get such a good deal. He's probably already driven it halfway across the country by now. Then you'll get it back, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. You'll contact him and explain that there was a mistake. There was no mistake, Susan replied cold. There was a decision that needed to be made, and I made it. You should be thanking me, not acting like I committed some kind of crime. But she had committed a crime. She had stolen my property and sold it without my knowledge or consent. The fact that she was my daughter didn't change that legal reality. I stood up slowly, my surgical incision pulling painfully, and walked toward the front door. Where are you going? Susan asked, suddenly sounding uncertain. To see for myself, I said. Mom, you just got out of the hospital. You shouldn't be walking around. But I was already at the door, fumbling with the handle with shaking fingers. I had to see the empty garage with my own eyes. I had to confirm that this nightmare was real. The late afternoon sun was blinding as I stepped outside. My neighbor Frank was watering his flower beds and looked up when he saw me. "Margaret," he called out with a smile. "Good to see you home. How are you feeling?" I couldn't answer. I could only walk toward my garage like a woman in a trance. The overhead door was heavy, but adrenaline gave me strength I shouldn't have had 3 days after major surgery. As it rolled up with its familiar groan, the empty space hit me like a physical blow. Nothing. Just oil stains on the concrete floor where my beautiful red Corvette had sat for 3 years. The car cover was folded neatly in the corner, as if Susan had wanted to make sure I knew this wasn't some mistake or break-in. This was deliberate, planned, executed while I was at my most vulnerable. Frank appeared beside me, his watering hose forgotten. "Margaret, where's your Corvette?" I turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in my face made him take a step back. "My daughter sold it," I said, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. Frank's eyes widened in shock. "Sold it? That beautiful car? But Margaret, that was worth $200,000, I finished quietly. Frank's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and then pure shock. $200,000? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, are you certain?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The number hung in the air between us like a physical thing. "But Susan sued me. She got $15,000 for it," Frank said slowly. "She seemed so proud of herself. She said she was helping you liquidate assets while you were recovering." The betrayal hit me anew. Not only had Susan sold my car without permission, but she had been bragging about it to the neighbors, making it sound like she was doing me some kind of favor. $15,000, I repeated numbly. She sold a $200,000 car for $15,000. Frank looked like he might be sick. "Margaret, that's a loss of $185,000, I finished, plus 30 years of memories that can't be replaced at any price. Behind us I heard Susan's footsteps on the driveway. She must have finally worked up the courage to follow me outside. "Mom, you need to come back inside," she said, her voice tight with forced control. "You're going to make yourself sick, and Frank doesn't need to be involved in our family business." Frank turned to look at my daughter with an expression I'd never seen on his gentle face before. Pure disgust. "Susan," he said quietly, "do you have any idea what you've done?" "I helped my mother make a practical decision about an asset she wasn't using," Susan replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "Not that it's any of your concern. Your mother just told me that car was worth $200,000, Frank said. "You sold it for $15,000. That's not a practical decision. That's impossible," Susan interrupted. "It was a 1967 Corvette. Old cars aren't worth that much unless they're in museums." I found my voice then, fueled by anger that was finally overtaking my shock. "I had it appraised 6 months ago, Susan. When you brought that man to my house without asking, remember?" The color drained from Susan's face. You had it appraised." "The formal appraisal is in my safety deposit box," I said, watching her carefully, "along with all the documentation proving I'm the sole owner of that vehicle." Susan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time since I'd known her, my daughter was speechless. "Where is the car now?" Frank asked, his voice deadly serious. The buyer took it yesterday," Susan stammered. "Some collector from New Hampshire. He paid cash." "What's his name?" I demanded. I don't remember exactly. Something with a B. Bradley? Bennett? "You don't remember the name of the man you sold my car to?" "It's written down somewhere," she said weakly. "In my purse. I have all the paperwork." Frank was shaking his head in disbelief. "Susan, this is serious. Really serious. You can't just sell someone else's property, even if you're family." "She gave me keys to the house," Susan protested. "She asked me to take care of things." "Taking care of things means watering plants and collecting mail," Frank replied sharply. "It doesn't mean selling cars that don't belong to you." I walked slowly back into the garage, my hand trailing along the workbench where Robert used to keep his tool. Everything else was exactly as we had left it. His old coffee can full of bolts and screws, the car magazines he had subscribed to until the day he died, the photo of our Corvette at the Mystic Car Show in Only the car was gone. "Mom," Susan said from behind me, her voice smaller now. "I honestly thought I was helping. You never drive it anymore, and the insurance costs so much money every year." I turned to face her and she took a step back at whatever she saw in my expression. "Susan," I said very quietly, "that car wasn't costing me money. It was giving me life. Every time I sat in it, I felt Robert next to me. Every time I started the engine, I heard his laugh. Every time I polished the chrome, I remembered 30 years of dreams coming true." Tears were streaming down my face now, but my voice remained steady. "You didn't sell my car, Susan. You sold my marriage. You sold my memories. You sold my memories. You sold the last piece of my husband I had left." "But Mom," she whispered, "it's just a car." "No," I said firmly, "it was never just a car. And deep down, you knew that. That's why you waited until I was helpless in a hospital bed. That's why you didn't call me first. That's why you didn't ask Michael's opinion. You knew I would never agree to this, so you decided to do it anyway." Frank cleared his throat. "Margaret, you need to call the police. This is theft, plain and simple." "I am not calling the police on my own daughter," Susan said quickly, panic creeping into her voice. "You might not have a choice," Frank replied. "This isn't about family anymore, Susan. This is about someone stealing a $200,000 vehicle." "But I'm her daughter," Susan protested. "Surely that gives me some rights." "It gives you exactly 0 rights to sell property that isn't yours," Frank said bluntly. "In fact, it makes it worse. This is elder abuse, Susan. Taking advantage of your mother while she was in the hospital." Elder abuse. The words hit Susan like a slap. She had probably never thought of herself as someone who would abuse an elderly person, but that's exactly what this was. "I need to sit down," I said suddenly, feeling lightheaded. The combination of surgery recovery, emotional shock, and sheer rage was taking its toll on my body. Frank immediately took my arm. "Let's get you inside, Margaret. Susan, you need to start making phone calls. You need to find this buyer and explain that a mistake was made." "What if he won't sell it back?" Susan asked, her voice barely audible. "Then you'll buy it back," Frank said firmly. "At fair market value, $200,000. Susan's face went white. "I don't have $200,000. "Then you'll find a way to get it," Frank replied without sympathy. "Because that's what it's going to take to fix what you've done." As Frank helped me toward the house, I heard Susan behind us, frantically dialing her phone. But I knew it was too late for simple phone call. This had gone far beyond a family misunderstanding. This was theft, and whether Susan wanted to admit it or not, she was about to learn that stealing from your own mother doesn't make the crime any less serious. It just makes the betrayal cut deep. Once we were back inside the house, Susan's panic transformed into the kind of desperate manipulation I'd seen her use since she was a child. When logical arguments failed, Susan always resorted to emotional warfare. "Mom, please," she said, following me into the living room where I collapsed back into Robert's chair. "You're blowing this completely out of proportion. It's not like I stole the car and ran off to Vegas. I put the money directly into your savings account." $15,000, I said flatly. "You put $15,000 into my account after stealing something worth $200,000. "I didn't know it was worth that much," she cried, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "How was I supposed to know? You never told me about any appraisal." "Because it wasn't your business," I replied. "Just like selling it wasn't your decision to make." Frank had positioned himself near the front door, clearly not wanting to leave me alone with Susan in this state. His presence was comforting, a witness to whatever was about to unfold. Susan began pacing around my living room, her real estate agent persona giving way to something much uglier underneath. "This is insane," she muttered. "I try to help you, and this is what I get. Accusations and threats, and neighbors getting involved in our private family business." "You want to talk about family business?" I asked, my voice rising despite my exhaustion. "Let's talk about how you waited until I was unconscious on an operating table to steal my property. Let's talk about how you've been pressuring me for months to get rid of everything that matters to me." "I wasn't pressuring you," Susan shot back. "I was trying to help you face reality. You're 68 years old, Mom. You live alone in a house that's too big for you, with a car you never drive, and you refuse to make any practical decisions about your future." "My future is none of your business," I said firmly. "It is when I'm the one who'll have to deal with the mess when something happens to you," she snapped, and there it was, the truth she'd been hiding behind all her talk of helping and caring. Susan wasn't worried about my well-being. She was worried about inconvenience, about having to deal with an elderly mother who owned things that seemed impractical to her. "Nothing is going to happen to me," I said. "I just had surgery to fix my heart. Dr. Martinez says I should have many good years ahead of me." "But what if something does happen?" Susan pressed. "What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have another heart episode? What if you develop dementia like Grandma Catherine did? I'm the one who'll have to sort through decades of your stuff, trying to figure out what's valuable and what's junk." The casual way she mentioned dementia made my blood run cold. Had Susan been hoping I would develop cognitive problems? Had she been planning this theft for longer than I realized? "So you decided to start early," Frank said from the doorway, his voice dripping with disgust. "Instead of waiting to see if your mother needed help, you just took matters into your own hands." Susan whirled around to face him. "This is between me and my mother. You have no right to interfere." "I have every right to speak up when I see someone being taken advantage of," Frank replied calmly. "Margaret is my neighbor and my friend. She deserves better than this." "She deserves better?" Susan's voice climbed to a shrill pitch. "I've been taking care of her for 3 years since Dad died. 3 years of phone calls and doctor's appointments and grocery shopping and checking on her every single day. Where were you during all of that? Taking care of me? I stared at my daughter in disbelief. Susan, you live 20 minutes away and visit maybe twice a month. You complain every time I call you, and you've spent 3 years trying to convince me to give up everything that makes me happy. I was trying to keep you safe, she insisted. That car is dangerous for someone your age. You can barely see over the steering wheel. I see just fine, I said, and I have a clean driving record, which is more than I can say for you and your 2 speeding tickets last year. Susan's face flushed red. She wasn't used to me fighting back this directly. Just then my phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael's number. Don't answer that, Susan said quickly. Why not? I asked, already reaching for the phone. Because you'll just upset him with all this drama, she said, moving toward me as if to grab the phone away. Frank stepped forward, blocking her path. Let your mother answer her phone, Susan. I accepted the call. Hello, Michael. Hi, Mom. My son's familiar voice was like a balm to my wounded heart. I was just calling to check on how you're settling in at home. Susan said she's been taking really good care of things while you were in the hospital. I looked directly at Susan as I spoke. Michael, I need to tell you something. Your sister sold Robert's Corvette while I was having surgery. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. She sold the car without my permission for $15,000. Jesus Christ, Michael breathed. Mom, that car was worth $200,000. I finished. I know. Another pause, longer this time. When Michael spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. Put Susan on the phone. Susan was shaking her head frantically, backing away from me. I don't want to talk to him right now. Susan, I said firmly. Your brother wants to speak with you. I said no, she shouted. Michael doesn't understand the situation. He lives 3,000 miles away. He has no idea what it's like dealing with. She caught herself, but not soon enough. Dealing with what? Michael's voice came clearly through the phone speaker. Dealing with our mother. Susan's composure finally cracked completely. Yes, she screamed. Dealing with our stubborn, impossible mother who won't listen to reason about anything, who clings to a dead man's possessions like they're going to bring him back, who refuses to accept that she's getting older and needs to make changes. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Susan seemed shocked by her own outburst. Give me the phone, Mom, Michael said quietly. I handed the phone to Susan, who took it with shaking hands. Michael, I shut up and listen. My son's voice was loud enough for all of us to hear. You stole our mother's car. You sold it for a fraction of its value while she was recovering from heart surgery, and now you're standing in her living room, screaming at her like she's the problem. You don't understand, Susan began. I understand perfectly. Michael cut her off. You've been wanting to get your hands on Mom's assets for years, and you finally found an opportunity. Well, congratulations, Susan. You just committed a felony. It's not a felony, Susan protested weakly. She's my mother. Theft is theft regardless of family relationships, Michael replied. And what you did is called elder abuse. Do you know what the penalties are for elder abuse in Connecticut? Susan's face had gone completely white. Michael, please, we can work this out as a family. We could have worked it out as a family if you had asked permission before selling a car that didn't belong to you, Michael said. But you didn't ask. You waited until Mom was helpless and you stole from her. I put the money in her account, Susan said desperate. You put $15,000 in her account after stealing something worth $200,000, Michael corrected. That's not restitution, that's adding insult to injury. Frank was nodding along with everything Michael was saying. I could see Susan realizing that she had no allies in this room, no one who was going to help her justify what she had done. I'm flying out tonight, Michael continued, and the first thing we're going to do is contact the police and report the theft. Then we're going to find this buyer and get Mom's car back. What if he won't sell it back? Susan asked, her voice barely a whisper. Then you're going to buy it back, Michael said firmly, at full market value, $200,000. I don't have that kind of money, Susan said. Then you'll get a loan, you'll sell your house, you'll liquidate your retirement fund. I don't care what you have to do, but you're going to make this right. Susan sank onto my couch, finally understanding the magnitude of what she had done. The tears started then, but they weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of self-pity. This will ruin me financially, she sobbed. You should have thought of that before you decided to steal from your mother, Frank said bluntly. And for the first time since I'd discovered the empty garage, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Michael was coming, Frank was supporting me, and Susan was finally beginning to understand that actions have consequences, even when your family, especially when your family. True to his word, Michael caught the first flight out of Portland and arrived at my house the next morning. The moment I opened the door and saw his familiar face, I broke down completely. All the shock and hurt I'd been holding back came pouring out as my son wrapped me in his arms. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered as I sobbed against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here to protect you." Michael had always been different from Susan. Where she saw dollar signs, he saw sentiment. Where she focused on practicality, he understood emotion. At 39, he was a successful architect in Portland, with a wife and 2 young children, but he had never forgotten what mattered most. After I composed myself, we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had counted money for our Corvette fund every Friday night for 30 years. Michael listened carefully as I told him everything: Susan's months of pressure, the secret appraisal, her behavior at the hospital, and the devastating discovery of the empty garage. "She planned this," Michael said when I finished. "This wasn't some spontaneous decision to help you declutter. She's been working up to this for months." "I should have seen it coming," I said miserably. "All the signs were there." "Mom, you trusted your daughter. That's not something you should apologize for." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "But now we need to fix this, and the first step is understanding exactly what we're dealing with legally." Michael had already made some calls during his flight. His brother-in-law was a lawyer in Oregon who had connected him with a colleague in Connecticut who specialized in elder law. "Her name is Patricia Hendricks," Michael explained. "She's agreed to see us this afternoon. She said what Susan did falls clearly under Connecticut's elder abuse statutes." The word abuse still made me flinch. I didn't want to think of my own daughter as an abuser, but the legal definition was apparently clear: taking advantage of an elderly person's vulnerability for financial gain. At 2 p.m., Michael and I sat in Patricia Hendricks' downtown Hartford office. She was a woman about Susan's age with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Thompson," she said after reviewing the notes Michael had prepared, "I want you to understand that what happened to you is unfortunately not uncommon. Adult children sometimes convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest when they're actually committing crimes." She explained that Connecticut law was very specific about elder abuse. Taking property from someone over 60 without their consent, especially while they're incapacitated, carries serious penalties. "We're talking about potential jail time for your daughter." "I don't want Susan to go to jail," I said quickly. "I just want my car back." "I understand," Patricia replied gently, "and that may be possible without criminal charges, depending on how cooperative your daughter is willing to be, but she needs to understand the seriousness of the situation." Patricia had already begun researching the cars. "Do you have any information about the buyer?" I pulled out the paperwork Susan had reluctantly provided the night before. The buyer's name was Bradley Morrison, and he lived in Keene, New Hampshire. He had paid cash and taken possession of the car immediately. "We'll contact Miss Morrison today," Patricia said. Often in these situations, the buyer had no idea the car was being sold without the owner's consent. "If we explain the circumstances, he may be willing to reverse the sale." "And if he's not?" Michael asked. "Then we pursue other options," Patricia replied. "But let's start with the assumption that Mr. Morrison is an honest collector who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time." That afternoon, Patricia called Mr. Morrison while Michael and I listened on speakerphone. The conversation was enlightening. "Miss Morrison," Patricia began, "I'm calling about the 1967 Corvette Stingray you purchased yesterday from Susan Miller." "Beautiful car," Bradley Morrison replied enthusiastically. "I've been looking for one just like that for years. Such a clean example, obviously well maintained." "Mr. Morrison, I need to inform you that the car was sold without the knowledge or consent of its actual owner." There was a long pause. "I don't understand." "The woman who sold it to me said it belonged to her mother, who had asked her to handle the sale. The mother in question is my client, Miss Margaret Thompson. She was in the hospital having heart surgery when her daughter sold the car. Mrs. Thompson never consented to the sale and wants her vehicle returned." Another pause, longer this time. "This is very troubling." The woman seemed legitimate. She had keys to the car, knew its history, had the title. "The title was obtained fraudulently," Patricia explained. "Mrs. Thompson is the sole legal owner of the vehicle." "My God," Bradley Morrison said quietly. "I had no idea. I would never knowingly buy stolen property." Patricia and I exchanged hopeful glances. Mr. Morrison sounded like exactly the kind of honest collector we'd hoped he would be. "Mr. Morrison," Patricia continued, "would you be willing to return the vehicle to Mrs. Thompson? She would, of course, reimburse you the $15,000 you paid." "Of course," he said immediately. "But there's a problem. I've already had the car transported to my home in New Hampshire, and I've begun some minor restoration work. Nothing major, just cleaning and detailing. I hope that hasn't caused any damage to its value." you. I'm sure it's fine, I said, speaking for the first time. I just want my husband's car back. Mrs. Thompson, Bradley Morrison's voice became gentler. I'm so sorry this happened to you. I have elderly parents myself, and the thought of someone taking advantage of them while they were sick, it's unconscionable. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at Patricia Hendrick's office. Susan arrived 15 minutes late, accompanied by her husband Mark and a lawyer they had hastily hired, a nervous-looking man named David Chen, who specialized in real estate law, not criminal defense. Susan looked terrible. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well, and her usually perfect appearance was disheveled. Mark sat beside her with the expression of a man who was realizing his wife had potentially destroyed their financial future. Patricia didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed a thick folder on the conference table and opened it methodically. Susan, she began, before we discuss any potential resolution to this matter, I need to make sure you understand the gravity of what you've done. Under Connecticut General Statute 53 and 19(2)(a), you have committed first-degree larceny of a motor vehicle. The penalty for this offense is up to 20 years in prison. Susan's lawyer, David Chen, cleared his throat. With respect, Miss Hendricks, this is a family matter. My client was acting in what she believed to be her mother's best interest. Intent is irrelevant, Patricia replied coolly. Your client sold property that didn't belong to her while the owner was incapacitated. The fact that she's related to the victim actually makes it worse under our elder abuse statutes. I watched Susan's face as the legal reality sank in. For the first time, she seemed to truly understand that this wasn't going to be resolved with tears and family guilt trip. Additionally, Patricia continued, your client committed fraud when she presented herself as having authority to sell the vehicle. She signed documents claiming ownership she didn't possess. That's an additional felony charge. Mark leaned forward, his face pale. What exactly are you asking for? Patricia slid a document across the table. Full restitution plus damages, plus legal fees, plus a binding agreement that Susan will never again interfere with Mrs. Thompson's property or financial decision. David Chen picked up the document and his eyes widened as he read, this is requesting $45,000 in restitution. The car only sold for $15,000. The car was worth $200,000, Michael said firmly. Susan's ignorance doesn't reduce the actual damage, but the car is being returned, Susan protested, speaking for the first time. Mom is getting it back. Why should I have to pay anything beyond what I received? Patricia's expression was ice cold. Because you caused damages beyond the temporary loss of the vehicle. Miss Thompson had to hire legal counsel. The car had to be transported back from New Hampshire. There were costs associated with the fraudulent title transfer, and most importantly, you put your mother through tremendous emotional distress during her recovery from major surgery. Emotional distress isn't a crime, David Chen said weakly. Elder abuse is, Patricia shot back, and that's exactly what this was. Taking advantage of an elderly person's vulnerability for financial gain, regardless of the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. Susan's composure finally cracked. I thought I was helping her, she cried. She never drives that car. It just sits in the garage costing money and taking up space. I thought if I handled the sale she wouldn't have to deal with the hassle. You thought wrong, I said quietly. It was the first time I had spoken directly to Susan since the meeting began. Mom, please, Susan turned to me with desperate eyes. You know I would never intentionally hurt you. I made a mistake, but it came from a place of love. Love? I repeated the word like it was foreign to me. Susan, you waited until I was unconscious on an operating table to steal the most precious thing I owned. You dismissed my grief over losing the last connection I had to your father. You told the neighbors you were helping me liquidate assets like I was already dead. That's not love. That's opportunism. Susan began crying, but I had seen these tears too many times before to be moved by them. Mrs. Thompson, David Chen said, surely we can reach some kind of family accommodation here. A formal lawsuit would be traumatic for everyone involved. Miss Chen, Patricia replied, your client committed serious crimes. The only reason we're sitting here instead of in criminal court is because Mrs. Thompson is being incredibly generous to her daughter. Mark finally spoke up. What happens if we refuse this agreement? Then we file criminal charges tomorrow morning, Patricia said without hesitation. Grand theft auto, elder abuse, fraud. Susan will be arrested, arraigned, and likely held pending trial since the value of the stolen property exceeds the threshold for serious felony. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Susan's continued crying. We don't have $45,000, Mark said finally. Then you'll get a loan, Michael replied. You'll liquidate assets. You'll do whatever it takes, just like you expected Mom to do when you wanted her to sell her house and car. This will bankrupt us, Susan whispered. You should have thought of that before you decided to steal a $200,000 car, I said firmly. David Chen was frantically scribbling notes. Could we possibly work out a payment plan? Patricia considered this. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to accept monthly payments over a reasonable period? I looked at Susan, this daughter I had raised and loved and supported for 42 years, the daughter who had waited until I was at my most vulnerable to betray me in the worst possible way. I'll accept payments over 2 years, I said finally. But there are conditions. What conditions? Susan asked warily. First, you will never again enter my house without explicit permission. No more dropping by unannounced. No more using emergencies as excuses to go through my belongings. Susan nodded reluctantly. Second, you will never again make suggestions about what I should do with my property, my money, or my living situation. My finances and my lifestyle choices are none of your business. Mom, I'm not finished, I interrupted. Third, you will apologize publicly to the neighbors for lying about my mental state and for implying that I had given you permission to liquidate my assets. Susan's face reddened. You want me to apologize to the neighbors? You bragged to them about helping me. Now you can explain that you actually stole from me. Take responsibility for your actions for once in your life. Mark was reading over the settlement agreement David Chen had passed to him. There's also a clause here about supervision of any future contact with Mrs. Thompson. What does that mean? Patricia explained. If Susan wants to visit her mother or have any contact regarding Mrs. Thompson's personal affairs, it must be in the presence of a neutral third party, either Michael or a family friend like Mr. Patterson from next door. You're treating me like a criminal, Susan protested. Because you are a criminal, Frank's voice came from behind us. I turned to see that he had arrived and was standing in the doorway of the conference room. I'm sorry I'm late, he said to Patricia, but I wanted to be here to thwart Margaret. Susan looked mortified. Her theft was now public knowledge among the neighbors, and Frank's presence meant she couldn't pretend this was just a private family disagreement. Miss Thompson, Patricia said, do you want to add any other conditions to this agreement? I thought for a moment. One more thing. Susan will attend financial counseling to address whatever compulsion led her to think she could spend money that didn't belong to her. And she'll attend therapy to work on her obvious issues with respecting other people's boundaries. That's ridiculous, Susan snapped. I don't need therapy. Then you can explain that to the criminal court judge, Patricia replied smooth. David Chen was looking increasingly uncomfortable with his client's hostility. Susan, I strongly advise you to accept these terms. The alternative is much worse. Mark grabbed his wife's arm. Susan, stop talking. We're accepting the deal. But Mark, we're accepting the deal, he repeated firmly. Before you make this any worse than it already is. It took another hour to finalize all the details, but by the end of the meeting, Susan had signed the settlement agreement. She would pay the full $45,000 over 24 months, plus commit to all the behavioral conditions I had outlined. As we prepared to leave, Susan made one last attempt at emotional manipulation. I hope you're happy, Mom, she said bitterly. You've chosen money over your own daughter. I stopped at the conference room door and turned to face her. Susan, I said quietly, you chose money over your own mother the moment you decided to steal from me while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. I'm not choosing money over you. I'm choosing self-respect over abuse, and that, Frank added as we left the room, is exactly what you should be doing. As Michael, Frank, and I walked out of the law office into the bright afternoon sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not just because I was getting my car back, but because I had finally stood up to the person who had been slowly eroding my confidence and independence for years. Susan would have to live with the consequences of her choices, but I was finally free to live with Mom. 3 days later, I stood in my garage watching as a car transport truck carefully backed up my driveway. My heart was racing with anticipation as the driver began the process of unloading my beloved Corvette. Michael stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, while Frank waited with his camera ready to document this moment. Half the neighborhood had gathered to witness the return of what everyone now knew was not just a car but a symbol of justice served. As the red Stingray rolled down the ramp, I gasped. Bradley Morrison hadn't been kidding when he said he'd been working on restoration. The car looked better than it had in years. The chrome gleamed like mirrors, the paint had been polished to a deep lustrous shine, and even the white interior had been carefully cleaned and conditioned. Mrs. Thompson? The transport driver approached with a clipboard. I have a personal note here from Mr. Morrison. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers and read, Dear Mrs. Thompson, I cannot express how sorry I am that my purchase of your beautiful car caused you such pain. I hope the small improvements I made can serve as my apology. Your Corvette is truly a treasure, and it belongs with someone who understands its real value. My best wishes for your continued health and happiness. Sincerely, Bradley Morrison. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the note carefully. Even a stranger had shown me more respect and consideration than my own daughter had. "Mom," Michael said softly, "would you like to take her for a drive?" I looked at the car that had been stolen from me, that I thought I'd lost forever, and nodded. Michael helped me into the driver's seat, and when I turned the key, the engine roared to life with that familiar rumble that had been the soundtrack of so many happy Sunday afternoons with Robert. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught sight of Susan's car parked across the street. She had been watching from a distance, too ashamed to approach directly. Our eyes met for a moment through my windshield, and I saw something that might have been regret in her expression, but regret wasn't enough anymore, not after what she had put me through. I drove through my neighborhood slowly, savoring the feeling of being behind the wheel of my own car again. Every turn, every gear shift, every subtle vibration of the engine was like greeting an old friend. Mrs. Patterson waved from her garden, and Miss Trun from down the street gave me a thumbs up as I passed. When I returned home 20 minutes later, Susan's car was gone. Over the following weeks, the conditions of our settlement agreement were gradually implemented. Susan made her first payment of $1,875 on time, though I noticed it came from a bank account that wasn't her usual one, probably a loan or credit advance. The public apology to the neighbors was painful to witness. Susan knocked on doors throughout our street, admitting that she had stolen my car and lied about having permission to sell it. Most neighbors received her confession with cold politeness, though Mrs. Patterson was more direct. "I hope you've learned something from this," she told Susan within my hearing. "Your mother is a treasure and she deserves better from her own children." Susan's real estate business did suffer, as Frank had predicted. Several clients found new agents after word spread about what she had done. In a profession built on trust, Susan's reputation for honesty had been permanently damaged. Michael stayed for 2 weeks, helping me establish new routines and making sure I felt secure in my own home again. Before he left, we had a long conversation about the future. "Mom, I want you to promise me something," he said as we sat in my garden one evening. "If you ever need help with anything at all, you'll call me first, not Susan." "Michael, I don't want to be a burden to you," I protested. "You have your own family to worry about." "You're not a burden," he said firmly. "You're my mother, and taking care of you when you need it isn't an obligation, it's a privilege." But what Susan did was not taking care of you, that was taking advantage of you. I promised Michael that I would reach out to him if I needed support, and he promised to visit more frequently. We also set up a system where I would send him copies of any important documents or appraisals, so there would always be someone besides me who knew the true value of my possession. The supervised visitation condition proved to be more of a relief than a burden. When Susan did come to see me, Frank or Michael was always present, which meant she couldn't pressure me about my living situation or make inappropriate comments about my belongings. Our conversations remained superficial but civil. During one of these supervised visits, about 2 months after the settlement, Susan finally offered what sounded like a genuine apology. "Mom," she said, her voice quiet and strained, "I've been going to therapy like the agreement requires, and I'm starting to understand how wrong I was, not just about selling the car but about everything, the way I've been treating you for years." I looked at her carefully. "What has your therapist told you? That I've been trying to control you instead of support you, that I was more worried about my own convenience than your happiness, and," she paused, struggling with the words, "that I was probably hoping you would become dependent on me so I could feel more important." It was the most honest thing Susan had said to me in years. "The car wasn't really about the money, was it?" I asked. Susan shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, it was about proving that I knew what was best for you better than you did. It was about being in charge of your life because I felt so out of control of my own." Frank, who was supervising this visit, nodded approvingly. "That's a start, Susan. A real The therapy seemed to be helping, but I remained cautious. Trust, once broken so completely, would take years to rebuild if it could be rebuilt at all. As spring turned to summer, I found myself driving the Corvette more often than I had in years. Not just for errands or necessary trips, but for the pure joy of it. Sunday drives through the Connecticut countryside, visits to car shows where fellow enthusiasts admired the restoration work Bradley Morrison had done, and simple evening cruises around my neighborhood. Each drive was a celebration of my independence, a reminder that at 68 I was still capable of making my own decisions about my own life. One sunny Saturday in August, exactly 6 months after my surgery, diary. I was polishing the Corvette in my driveway when a young woman approached me. She was probably in her 30s with a worried expression and a manila folder in her hands. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Mrs. Thompson?" "Yes, I am. My name is Jennifer Walsh. I heard about what happened with your daughter and your car. I was wondering if I could ask you some questions." It turned out that Jennifer was dealing with a similar situation. Her mother-in-law was trying to pressure Jennifer's elderly grandmother into signing over her house, claiming the old woman couldn't manage on her own anymore. "I don't know what to do," Jennifer confessed. "Grandma Rose is 81, but she's sharp as a tack. She doesn't want to give up her house, but my mother-in-law keeps telling her it's for her own good." I invited Jennifer to sit on my porch and we talked for over an hour. I shared Patricia Hendricks' contact information and explained how Connecticut's elder abuse laws could protect her grandmother. More importantly, I told her that the elderly person's wishes mattered more than anyone else's opinion about what was practical or sensible. "The most important thing," I told Jennifer, "is that your grandmother knows she has people who will support her decisions, not try to override them." After Jennifer left, I realized that my experience with Susan, painful as it had been, had given me something valuable: the knowledge and confidence to help other families avoid similar betrayals. As I write this story, it's been almost a year since Susan stole my car. She has made every payment on schedule and completed the required therapy. Our relationship will never be what it was before, but it's evolving into something more honest if more distant. Michael visits every few months, and we talk on the phone weekly. Frank continues to be a wonderful neighbor and friend. And most importantly, I wake up every morning knowing that my home, my possessions, and my decisions are my own. The Corvette sits in my garage, gleaming and ready for our next adventure. Sometimes I start the engine just to hear Robert's memory and the rumble of the motor. Sometimes I sit in the driver's seat and remember 30 years of Friday night dreams and 15 years of Sunday afternoon joy. But most often, I simply drive, not because I have to, but because I can. Because at 68 years old, I've learned that the most important drive you can take is the one that leads you back to yourself. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who thought they knew what was best for you? Have you had to defend your right to make your own decisions about your own life? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Remember, age doesn't make your dreams less valid or your possessions less precious. You have the right to live your life on your own terms, regardless of what anyone else thinks is practical or sensible. If you enjoyed this story and it resonated with your own experiences, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about family, boundaries, and finding the courage to stand up for yourself. Share this with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your independence. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let others drive your life. Keep your hands on your own steering wheel.